So I want to give a quick presentation on the three doored structures that can be found around the world, because they're a very important part of Black culture and our history, and these three doored structures can be found everywhere in the world, proving the African presence everywhere in the world. So I want to show you a few of them, and then I'll explain the meaning of these structures and why our ancestors built these structures everywhere. So this is King Seti of Egypt, who ruled 3,300 years ago, and within his tomb is found one of the oldest known models of the three-door structures that were built all over the world. So at the top left, we have a three-doored structure in Europe that was built by the Moors. And on the top right, you can see one of the coat of arms of the Moors shows these three-doored structures. And on the bottom, you can see an ancient structure built by the indigenous people of America. And this is also a three-doored structure as well. So at the top, we have one of many of the three-doored structures that can be found in Europe. This one is located in Spain. And at the bottom, this is Petra, Jordan, located in the Middle East. So at the top, we have a few of the many three-doored structures that can be found in South America. And at the bottom, we see Moctezuma inside of his three-doored structure as well. Here we have the three-doored structures of Bali. And here we have one of the oldest structures in Puerto Rico, which is also a three-doored structure. And this is my favorite one. This is an old church in Baltimore City. And if you've ever been to Baltimore City, you will see that Baltimore City is filled with old Moorish churches, or I should say Moorish buildings. And a lot of these buildings have been turned into Catholic churches. And many people just assume that white people built these churches. But we can look at the oldest Christian churches in America, and we can see what they look like. And they are nothing compared to the existing buildings that already existed in the Americas prior to the arrival of white people. And many people today just assume that white people built these grand structures, but they did not. And we can just look at the churches that were built by white people and compare them to the structures that already existed in America. And this will make you rethink what you think you know about white people ruling the Americas and how everything began. And I'm not going to get into the history of the Moors in America because that's not what this video is about. But moving forward, pay attention to the older buildings that you can find in major cities in America, such as Baltimore, New York. Any of these major cities, you will find older Moorish buildings. Pay attention to the architecture and then compare that to modern Christian churches, even to the first Christian churches that were put up and built in the Americas by white people. If you compare the two, you'll see that the older structures that can be found in the United States were built by the Moors. Not only were they built by the Moors, but they are also three-doored structures. So we can look at the Inca and the pre-Inca civilizations and the Egyptian civilizations, and we can clearly see that these three-doored structures all around the world were built by our ancestors. Now I want to talk about why our ancestors built these three-doored structures. So the three doors on all of these structures represent what white people have called false doors. And I don't like the term false doors because the ancient civilizations considered these three doors spiritual portals. So these three doors on all of these structures are always facing west. And this is because the land of the west is associated with the land of the dead. So the three doors represent the three brightest stars of Orion. And what can you find behind the three brightest stars of Orion? And that is the Orion Nebula, where stars are born. The ancient Egyptians and the Cushites believed that the false doors, or the spiritual portals, were thresholds between the worlds of the living and the dead. And this was a way that the dead and the living could communicate. So this all goes back to ancestral worship. So our ancestors would place offerings before the doors for the dead. The doors were considered portals to the land of the dead, and the land of the dead is associated with Osiris, which is Orion, and this is the birthplace of all of the new stars. All of the stars that are born, and we are the stars. All of these three-doored structures built by our ancestors were used for communication between the dead and the living, and they were considered portals to the land of the dead, where the living could go and communicate with their ancestors. And the reason that you see all of these areas empty without populations, and many of these locations are quarantined off by white people, this is because one of the things that white people have done everywhere in South America, North America, even in locations in Africa, all over the world, they have banned ancestral worship. And the majority of African people in the Americas don't realize that this is not something that just happened in the Americas. This is something that white people have done all over the world. I was actually talking to a friend of mine in Kenya a few months ago, and we were talking about the subject of what white people have done in Kenya. And some of the main things that he said is many people have become Christian or Muslim, and they have abandoned their culture and ancestral worship. And white people have banned ancestral worship, and it reminded me of what they did to the indigenous people of the Americas. White people created laws forbidding indigenous people from celebrations involving ancestral worship. And what they've done is cut us off, disconnecting us from our ancestral connection, preventing us from accessing the heavenly powers of the universe, cutting us off from a power more real than any power that white people claim to possess upon the earth. So the three-doored structures around the world were built by our ancestors for the purpose of connecting with our ancestors. They are spiritual portals between the dead and the living, or I should say the living and the living, the two realms. And I'll tell you a secret about the meaning of Osiris, or becoming the Osiris. The Egyptian king and all of the righteous souls achieved a level of righteousness so great that they became the judge of the dead. But here's the truth that many people can't see. The king becomes the Osiris, meaning the dead king is his own judge. Because the laws of the universe do not bring judgment to the righteous soul. The righteous are without judgment. If you look at all of the funeral scenes in Egypt, this is that of Tutankhamun. But if you look at the funeral scene, Tutankhamun upon his death becomes the Osiris. So if Tutankhamun becomes the Osiris, becomes the judge of the souls, the judge of the dead, this means that the righteous Tutankhamun is the judge of his own soul. Because, as I've said, the righteous are without judgment. Now, it's no coincidence that when the white races began to invade all of the territories of the earth, that they set themselves up as kings, and they, especially in Rome with the popes and the Queen of England, they set themselves up as righteous rulers of the world. They claim to be your judges, And in ancient times, the righteous spirit was without judgment because they spent their whole life achieving righteousness. And now the invading white races claim that they are your judges, and they have gone around the world destroying indigenous black populations, disconnecting them from the heavens, and giving them an earthly judge, along with false religions and ways of thinking. And black people are so confused and lost in the Abrahamic religions that they don't know who they are anymore. They don't know who their ancestors are, where they come from, and they're trying to find answers in DNA kits, and they're failing to see the truth. The reason that you don't know who your ancestors are is because you've been cut off from these spiritual connections. And the fact that black people of the Americas are doing these DNA tests and searching for their ancestors, it proves the natural needs and wants and desires of the heart to seek our ancestral beginnings. And this shows us that not only how much we need this ancestral connection, but it proves to us that this is something that is naturally important to us. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be collectively seeking who we are and seeking this ancestral connection. So our ancestors created these structures at specific locations on earth, all over the world, as spiritual portals to connect with our ancestors, creating a perpetual connection and alignment of forces between heaven and earth. And this is why black people need to know why these three-doored structures were built and why they are so important to our connection with the stars.